Chapter 1. Drunken Deals and Unexpected Agreements. Rain poured relentlessly outside the Rusty Anchor, a pub nestled in Soho, London. Raindrops pounded against the fogged-up windows, blurring the dim glow of the streetlights in the cold, unforgiving night. Inside, the air was slightly warmer, thanks to a crackling fireplace in the far corner. However, the scent of damp, aged wood mixed with the sharp tang of ale and whiskey still lingered in the atmosphere. Laughter and chatter filled the crowded space near the bar, blending with the offbeat saxophone notes of a small jazz band, playing more out of habit than passion. Eleanor Ellie Hart, 34, sat alone at the counter, the worn heels of her old boots resting lightly against the footrest of the bar stool. Before her sat a glass of scotch and soda, the ice melting into lazy rings in the pale amber liquid. She twirled the glass between her slender fingers, her gaze fixed on it as if hoping to drown her fears in the alcohol. Ellie was a freelance journalist, specializing in food and lifestyle pieces for small magazines. A job she loved, but one that barely kept her afloat, especially with the crushing debt hanging over her. She took a sip of whiskey, the burn trailing down her throat making her grimace, though she still managed a wry smile. £1.5 million, she muttered, just loud enough for the bartender to hear, though he didn't bother turning around. £1.5 million for my father to throw away at the casino, and now I've got loan sharks breathing down my neck. She scoffed, taking another large sip, the warmth spreading through her chest but doing nothing to erase the fear. Her father, a notorious gambler, had borrowed money from the underworld to fuel his addiction, only to abandon his family when everything collapsed. To protect her mother and younger brother from the inevitable consequences, Ellie had taken on the debt herself, £1.5 million. And now the loan sharks were closing in. A few seats away, James Jim Caldwell, 38, sat as still as a statue, carved from cold granite. His dark gray suit fit his tall frame impeccably, without a single wrinkle, an embodiment of his rigid perfectionism. A venture capitalist running one of London's largest investment firms, he specialized in funding tech startups and high-end real estate deals. Before him was a glass of single malt whiskey, neat, no ice, an expensive, untainted indulgence. He didn't drink it, though. Instead, he held the glass in his hand, his thumb tracing the rim absent-mindedly. His deep blue eyes swept across the bar, stopping at Ellie as she continued mumbling to herself. He hated noise. He hated people who couldn't control their emotions. But something about this woman held his gaze, a strange mix of sadness and a smile on her face, an odd contradiction that intrigued him. Ellie, unaware of James's scrutiny, was busy scribbling calculations onto a crumpled napkin. The tip of her pen, bearing the imprint of her teeth, scrawled numbers across the thin paper. Loan sharks, £1.5 million. Interest, obviously increasing daily. Freelance writing income. Not even enough to buy this whiskey. She stopped, massaging her temples, then suddenly burst into bitter laughter, a sound so dry and sardonic that a few men nearby turned to look. What should I do? Sell a kidney? No, they'd probably want my whole damn life, she muttered, finishing her drink and signaling for another. The desperation of someone running from reality thick in her voice. James frowned. Her laughter was like a thorn in his carefully maintained silence. He disliked weak people, and she was clearly drowning herself in whiskey to mask her fear. But when the bartender placed another scotch and soda before her, James suddenly spoke, his voice deep and icy. You're too loud. How much do you owe? Ellie turned, slightly surprised, then grinned despite the drunken haze in her eyes. £1.5 million, she answered, raising her glass in a mock toast. Enough for the loan sharks to cut me into pieces. Wouldn't you say, Mr. Ice Cold? She winked, but James didn't react. He simply stared at her with unreadable intensity. Answer seriously, he said, his tone even, as if evaluating a business investment. Ellie shrugged, setting her glass down with a soft clink. I am serious. £1.5 million, courtesy of my bastard father. He borrowed from the wrong people to gamble, lost everything, and disappeared, leaving my mom and brother with the mess. I took on the debt so they wouldn't get hurt, and now here I am, drinking to forget, but hell, forgetting isn't that easy. She chuckled dryly, taking another sip, her eyes clouded with whiskey and sorrow. James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied her, her loosely tied brown hair, the oversized gray sweater, the way she absent-mindedly spun her whiskey glass as if it were her last lifeline. She wasn't conventionally stunning, but there was something captivating in her presence, in her voice, laced with exhaustion, yet full of biting humor. "You drink too much," he observed coldly. Ellie burst into laughter, slapping the bar. "Oh, you noticed. But hey, you're holding a glass too. Drink with me. Tell me a funny story. Or do you not know how to laugh?" She leaned toward him, her drunken mischief shining through. James smirked. Barely. It wasn't quite a smile, just a subtle twitch of his lips. "I don't need to be entertained," he replied, but took a sip of his whiskey anyway. The sharp burn cleared his thoughts, yet somehow he found himself caught in her chaotic energy. They started talking. At first, brief clipped sentences from James and teasing remarks from Ellie. But by the fourth drink, the distance between them began to dissolve. Ellie talked about her father, laughing bitterly as she cursed him. "He once gambled away my brother's tuition and told us, 'Life's a bet. You lose some, you win some.'" What a joke. James sat still, but his jaw clenched slightly at her imitation of her father. He, in turn, spoke about his failed marriage. Ellie howled with laughter. "No wonder you're as cold as a fridge. You got dumped for being emotionally unavailable, didn't you?" They drank more, laughed more, and as the pub emptied out, both were thoroughly drunk. "Let's go," Ellie said, grabbing James's wrist with the confidence of a drunkard. "I can't go home. Those loan sharks are probably waiting." James, his mind clouded with whiskey, didn't resist. They stumbled out into the rain, clothes damp from the downpour, and found themselves in a small hotel nearby. The night blurred into a mess of laughter, teasing, and unexpected intimacy between two strangers. The next morning, James woke up first, his head pounding. He turned to see Ellie, fast asleep, her hair a tangled mess, sweater slipping off one shoulder. A thought struck him. As a venture capitalist, he always sought the most efficient solution to a problem. He needed an heir to appease his mother. She needed a way out of her debt. He shook her awake, his voice calm and firm. "I'll pay your £1.5 million debt. You'll have my child." Ellie blinked, groggy, then burst into laughter despite her hangover. "You sober up fast. Already thinking about deals after a drunk night?" She sat up, rubbing her temples. "I'm not a baby-making machine, but let me think. Having a child isn't exactly a small favor, Mr. Ice Cold." She stood, wobbly, searching for her boots. "Give me a few days, I'll let you know." James remained expressionless, pulling out a notepad and scribbling a quick contract outline. "No emotions," he stated, pushing the paper toward her. "Decide quickly. I live in Mayfair. Caldwell Tower, 30th floor." Ellie skimmed the paper, smirking. "No emotions, huh? We'll see about that." 3 days later, she stood outside his penthouse, hands trembling as she knocked. The loan sharks had come for her mother the night before. She had no other choice. James opened the door, expression unreadable. "Decided?" Ellie sighed, signing the contract with a flourish, adding a line at the bottom, "One condition, make me laugh." She met his gaze, winking. "Let's see what happens, Mr. Ice Cold." James folded the paper, his voice steady. "Come in." As Ellie stepped inside, she whispered to herself, £1.5 million and an iceberg to melt. This should be fun. Welcome to Soul Stories. Life can be overwhelming, but here we share heartfelt tales to bring you peace, joy, and inspiration. Your support, every comment, like, and follow, means the world to us. It motivates us to create more meaningful and uplifting stories just for you. Did our latest story touch your heart? Leave a "I am happy" in the comments if you agree. Subscribe now and be part of a community that spreads love, kindness, and positivity. Let's make every day a little brighter, together. Chapter 2. A Marriage Full of Drama. James Caldwell's penthouse occupied the 30th floor of Caldwell Tower in Mayfair, London, a space so flawlessly cold it perfectly mirrored its owner. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the shimmering lights of the Thames, but inside the apartment was as lifeless as a modern art gallery. The glossy black wooden floors held not a speck of dust. The rigid gray leather sofa looked too uncomfortable to sit on, and the bookshelves were lined with dry finance and investment reports. No plants, no paintings, no signs of life. This wasn't a home, just a place to exist in icy solitude. But that evening, when Eleanor Ellie Hart stepped in with a scuffed red suitcase and a bag full of cooking essentials, that sterile, frozen world started to crack. Drama had officially moved in. Ellie, 28, was no naive girl. A seasoned freelance journalist specializing in food and lifestyle, she set her suitcase down in the middle of the living room with a loud thud, a declaration that she wasn't going to be some silent wife in this unexpected contract marriage. Dressed in an oversized gray sweater and jeans, her brown hair tied in a messy ponytail, she glanced around and whistled in amusement. "Damn, do you live in a freezer, James?" she called out, her voice echoing in the vast empty space. "You should open an ice cream shop here. No need for a fridge." James stood near the window holding a glass of water. He had sworn off whiskey after their drunken night at the Rusty Anchor, determined to keep a clear head in this agreement. He was dressed impeccably as always, a crisp white shirt buttoned up to his throat, black trousers and polished leather shoes that gleamed under the ceiling lights. He turned, his deep blue eyes locking onto Ellie as if she were an intruder in his meticulously controlled world. "No noise in my house," he stated flatly, his voice cold and final, as if issuing a corporate mandate. Ellie smirked, utterly unfazed. "No noise? Then you married the wrong woman, Mr. Iceberg," she shot back, dragging her suitcase to the corner, mischief twinkling in her eyes. Thus began the chaotic cohabitation of a playful troublemaker and a man as rigid as steel. That evening, Ellie unpacked her cooking supplies and made a beeline for the kitchen, a minimalist space so untouched it might as well have been part of a showroom. The pristine marble countertops gleamed under the soft lights, and the state-of-the-art oven looked like it had never been used. "Do you ever cook, James? This place is so clean it feels like a staged kitchen for a real estate ad," she teased, setting down a heavy cast-iron skillet with an audible clang, a deliberate act of defiance. James remained near the window, silent, watching her with his usual detached expression. Ellie, unfazed, lit the stove and expertly sliced garlic, her knife moving with the confidence of someone who knew their way around a kitchen. Soon the scent of butter sizzling with herbs filled the apartment, wrapping around the sterile walls like a warm embrace. The air was no longer cold. It smelled like home. James, despite himself, took a step closer. "I hate the smell of food," he said icily, gesturing toward the stove as if ordering her to stop. Ellie turned, eyes twinkling with mischief. "Hate it, huh? Then why are you standing here breathing it all in? Go back to your iceberg, Mr. Iceberg," she teased, flipping the chicken with a practiced wrist. James remained rooted in place, frowning. When the chicken was finally done, Ellie cut a small piece, blew on it to cool it down, and held it up toward him. "Try it, I promise. It's good." James stared at the bite-sized offering as if she were handing him poison. "I don't eat food cooked by others," he stated coldly. Ellie raised an eyebrow and stepped closer, invading his space. "Oh, you will eat this, Mr. Iceberg," she challenged. "What's the worst that could happen? You might actually like it?" James exhaled slowly, clearly irritated, but before he could refuse again, Ellie took another step closer, forcing him against the kitchen counter. "Come on, take a bite. Just one. Be brave," she teased. James let out a resigned sigh, leaned forward slightly, and took a small bite. He chewed slowly, expression unreadable. The rich, buttery flavors melted on his tongue, the perfect balance of herbs and seasoning. "It's tolerable," he finally said. Ellie grinned and clapped her hands. "Tolerable? From you, that's basically a Michelin star review," she laughed. James said nothing, turning on his heel and walking back to the living room. But Ellie swore she saw him take one last deep breath, as if savoring the lingering aroma, before disappearing behind his laptop. Ellie wasn't done shaking up his world. The next day, while James was focused on work, she snuck a small speaker under his desk. As soon as he started typing, she blasted an upbeat English folk song, violins screeching, tambourines clashing. James nearly jumped, his pen slipping from his fingers. "What the hell?" he growled, looking around sharply. Ellie, pretending to wipe the kitchen counter, turned with an innocent smile. "Oh, you don't like music, Mr. Iceberg. I thought you could use some excitement." James stalked over, found the speaker, and switched it off with a sharp flick. "Are you trying to drive me insane?" he asked, voice dangerously low. Ellie grinned. "Insanity is the first step to melting," she sang, winking before sauntering back to the kitchen. 2 months later, Ellie stood in the bathroom, staring at the pregnancy test in her hands. 2 pink lines, clear as day. She marched into the living room where James was reading the newspaper and held it up triumphantly. "Congratulations, Mr. Iceberg." James looked up, his sharp blue eyes flicking to the test, then back at her. 9 months, he stated simply. Ellie flopped onto the couch beside him, resting her chin in her hand. 9 months to make you melt, she murmured, eyes sparkling. And now I have a little ally to help me. James folded his newspaper, rising from his seat, but as he passed the kitchen, he paused for the briefest second, just long enough to inhale the familiar scent of Ellie's herb-roasted chicken. Ellie smirked. "You're melting, James." Slowly but surely. Chapter 3, The First Feelings. James Caldwell's penthouse in Mayfair was no longer the lifeless, icy box it had been when Ellie Hart first moved in. Her presence, though only for a few weeks, had quietly softened its rigid edges. A bright orange beanbag chair sat beside the cold gray leather sofa. 2 tiny potted plants on the windowsill. Ellie called them the Leaf Brothers, and the lingering aroma from the kitchen, where she transformed simple ingredients into dishes that made the space feel less lonely. Yet James's signature chill remained. The sleek black hardwood floors, bookshelves filled with financial reports, and the heavy silence, at least until Ellie decided to shake things up. Now 4 months pregnant, Ellie lay sprawled on the beanbag, one hand resting on her belly, legs draped over the armrest. She wore a loose-knit sweater and jeans, her brown hair tied up high to keep it out of the way while she cooked. A hobby she had brought into this apartment as a way to assert her presence. A few feet away, James sat at his desk, eyes locked on his laptop screen, fingers typing steadily. He remained as composed as ever. Crisp white dress shirt buttoned all the way up, black slacks, polished leather shoes lined up neatly under the desk. But today, he wasn't as focused as usual. The scent of Ellie's lunchtime pesto pasta still lingered in the air, and he had to admit, though only to himself, that he had grown addicted to her cooking, despite always pretending otherwise. Ellie sighed dramatically, sat up, and rubbed her belly with exaggerated flair. "Mr. Ice King," she called out, drawing out the words theatrically. "Minnie in here is protesting. I have cravings, desperate cravings, for a sausage sandwich. Do you have one?" She tilted her head, eyes twinkling mischievously. James looked up, frowning slightly. "No," he replied, his deep voice even and unbothered. "Drink some water." He turned back to his screen, as if to shut the conversation down immediately. Ellie burst out laughing, then stood and walked over to his desk. "Water? Do I look like a cactus to you? I'm pregnant. I need a hot, juicy sausage sandwich with a little mustard on top." She placed her hands on her hips, giving him a half-serious, half-playful look. "Go get me one. It's the middle of the night, but I'm craving it." James glanced at the wall clock, 1 a.m., before looking back at her, his gaze sharp as ice. "You're insufferable," he muttered coolly, but for once he didn't refuse outright. Instead, he stood, grabbed his coat from the rack by the door, and, his hands shaking slightly as he put it on, though Ellie didn't notice, said simply, "Wait here." Then he left, without another glance. Ellie stood frozen, mouth slightly open. "Wait, you're actually going?" she called after him, but the door had already shut. 30 minutes later, James returned, carrying a paper bag from the 24-hour convenience store down the street. He set it on the kitchen counter and pulled out a still-warm sausage sandwich, exactly as she'd requested, mustard and all, before pushing it toward her, his hand still faintly trembling. "For the baby," he said flatly, turning away as if to hide his awkwardness. Ellie let out a delighted laugh, clapping her hands together. "Oh, James, you're adorably awkward." She eagerly opened the bag, took a big bite, and closed her eyes in bliss. "But your hands are shaking. Don't tell me you were scared of me." James didn't reply. He simply sat down on the couch and pretended to read the newspaper, but Ellie knew he was sneaking glances at her. She didn't stop there. The next morning she made garlic toast, crispy slices of bread coated in butter and garlic, and placed a plate in front of James as he worked. "Minnie says you need to smile," she teased, standing beside him with a mischievous glint in her eyes. "Try it. It's better than last night's sandwich." James stared at the plate, then at her, before reluctantly picking up a piece. The rich, savory flavor melted in his mouth, but he merely smirked, just barely, and muttered, "Ridiculous." Yet he didn't return the plate. Instead, he kept it on his desk and ate every last bite in silence. Ellie grinned to herself, knowing he was hooked. He kept his cold exterior, but every time she made pesto pasta or roast chicken, James finished his plate without leaving a single bite, all while insisting, "I don't like it." Ellie kept teasing him, sticking smiley face stickers on his laptop, spilling sauce just so he'd have to clean it up with her. Little pranks that slowly made James accustomed to her presence. But marriage wasn't always laughter. Ellie Hart and James Caldwell's married life wasn't always filled with laughter and playful pranks. One drizzly afternoon, gray light filtered through the large glass windows of their Mayfair penthouse. Ellie sat curled up on her bright orange beanbag, the spot where she usually lounged to tease James or binge-watch comedy shows. But today she wasn't laughing. Her phone vibrated in her hand, and when she answered, her mother's trembling voice cut through the speaker like a knife. "Ellie, your father. He passed away. Some fight broke out somewhere. I don't know the details." Ellie sat frozen, clutching the phone tightly, her eyes turning red as she stared into the void. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks, soaking into the oversized gray sweater she wore. But she made no sound. She just sat there, motionless, her empty gaze fixed on the window, where raindrops streamed down like the grief she was desperately trying to hold back. James, seated on the sofa a few feet away, had been reading his usual financial paper. But when the familiar sound of Ellie's laughter didn't fill the space as expected, he looked up, and he saw her. Not the mischievous, smiling Ellie he had grown used to, but a small, fragile figure with silent tears falling. He hesitated, the newspaper in his hands suddenly meaningless. Her silence unsettled him, not because he disliked noise, as he often claimed, but because it was too different, too unfamiliar. He had grown used to her voice, her laughter, her presence, even if he never admitted it, and for the first time he couldn't just sit still. James rose to his feet, the soft click of his polished leather shoes against the black hardwood floor, echoing in the quiet room. He walked over and stopped in front of her, hesitating for a moment before awkwardly settling onto the beanbag beside her, something he had never done before. The seat was too small for both of them, forcing him to sit close, their shoulders touching, but he didn't pull away. "Don't cry," he said, his deep voice uncharacteristically unsteady, as if he were searching for words in a foreign language. He placed a hand on her shoulder, stiff, unsure, his fingers slightly trembling as they met the damp fabric of her sweater. He didn't know what to do, only that he couldn't leave her sitting there alone. Ellie turned, her tear-filled eyes meeting his, surprised by the unexpected closeness. She let out a weak, sad smile through her tears. "That's a strange way to comfort someone, Ice King," she murmured, her voice hoarse as she wiped at her eyes, though the tears kept falling. "But thank you." She lowered her gaze, gripping her phone tightly, as if clinging to the last fragile remnants of a father who had abandoned their family over gambling debts. They sat there for a long time, saying nothing. The only sounds were the soft patter of rain against the glass and Ellie's quiet, uneven breaths. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "My dad. He used to be good. He used to make sandwiches for me before gambling ruined him." She paused, another tear slipping down her cheek, but this time, she didn't bother wiping it away. "I hated him for leaving us, but I still miss him. Is that ridiculous?" James didn't answer right away. He studied her, his deep blue eyes flickering with something unreadable. He wasn't used to emotions, wasn't good at dealing with other people's pain, but for the first time, he opened up. "I was married once," he admitted, his voice low and rough. "She left me, said I was too cold." He turned his gaze toward the window, avoiding Ellie's eyes. I don't know how not to be cold, he murmured. I'm not good at this. Ellie blinked, startled by the rare confession. Then, despite the tears still clinging to her lashes, she gave a small, knowing smile. She just didn't know how to break the ice, she said softly. Like I'm doing now. And then she leaned her head against his shoulder. This time James didn't move away. His hand remained on her shoulder, no longer stiff, but a little gentler, like he was learning slowly how to hold her pain alongside his own. They sat there, speaking only in quiet stories. Ellie told him about the father she once loved, the man who used to make her sandwiches, who would burn them every time but still laugh about it. And James, in return, spoke a little more about his broken marriage. His words were brief, matter-of-fact, but enough for Ellie to see that he wasn't entirely made of ice. I thought I didn't need anyone, he admitted, voice barely above a whisper, until you turned this place upside down. Ellie let out a soft chuckle. So that means I win, right? The ice begins to crack. James didn't respond, only tightened his grip slightly on her shoulder, his gaze fixed on the rain beyond the glass. They didn't exchange long conversations or flowery words, but in that moment, they understood each other more. Not as two strangers bound by a contract, but as two souls finally beginning to connect. Ellie wiped her tears and leaned against him just a little longer. She whispered, "Thank you, James." He didn't say anything. He simply sat there, letting her warmth seep into him. And for the first time, the ice within him truly cracked, not because of her laughter, but because of her tears. A few days later, Ellie began noticing small changes in James. One morning, she found a bag of fresh grapes on the kitchen counter, with no explanation. When she asked, James merely replied in his usual cold tone, "For the baby." But Ellie knew it wasn't just for that. One evening, as she cooked pasta, James unexpectedly stepped into the kitchen. He stood closer than usual, quietly inhaling the aroma without a word. And then one night, under the faint glow of the moon filtering through the penthouse windows, everything changed. The first kick. Ellie lay curled on the sofa, hugging a soft pillow, her eyes absent-mindedly watching an old cooking show on TV. The night was quieter than usual, just the sound of raindrops tapping against the glass and the rhythmic clicking of James's keyboard from across the room. As always, he was immersed in his world of numbers, dressed in a crisp white shirt, his deep blue eyes focused on the screen, seemingly oblivious to her presence, or at least pretending to be. Then in an instant, the silence shattered. Ellie suddenly sat up, her hands flying to her belly, eyes wide with surprise and excitement. "Oh my God, Minnie just kicked me," she gasped, her voice breaking through the stillness. James's fingers paused mid-typing, his thick brows furrowed in that familiar way as he looked up at her, his expression unreadable, half skeptical, half cautious, as if unsure whether she was serious or playing another one of her tricks. "Come here, feel it." Ellie waved him over eagerly, her eyes gleaming like she had just discovered a hidden treasure. James hesitated. His fingers tapped lightly against the wooden desk, a silent beat of hesitation. He wasn't comfortable with things he couldn't control, things that didn't fit neatly into his plans. And the kick of a tiny life inside Ellie's belly was something he had never even thought about. But there was something about the way she called him, about the sheer excitement in her voice, that he couldn't ignore. Slowly he stood up. His leather shoes clicked softly against the black hardwood floor as he walked toward the sofa with an air of rigid determination, like a soldier stepping into battle without knowing what awaited him. He sat beside her, closer than usual, their shoulders brushing against each other in the small space. "Put your hand here," Ellie instructed, grabbing his hand and pressing it gently against her stomach. James froze. His hand stiffened under hers, his breath momentarily catching, as if he were bracing for something unknown. Then, there it was, a soft but distinct movement, a tiny kick, light but undeniable, pressing against the palm of his hand. James flinched slightly, his fingers instinctively curling, as if unsure how to react. But he didn't pull away. The sensation unsettled him. It was real. More real than the numbers in his reports, more real than the orders he gave in boardrooms. This wasn't a theory or a calculation. It was a life, small, fragile, yet inexplicably strong. A reminder that he wasn't just James Caldwell, the cold venture capitalist. He was about to become a father. His hand remained on her belly, unmoving, as his deep blue eyes darkened. Not with coldness, but with something quieter, something deeper. The ice within him melted just a little more. "Minnie, behave," he murmured, his voice lower than usual, carrying an unfamiliar warmth. Ellie let out a bright laugh, playfully patting his shoulder. "Oh, I bet the baby just called you Daddy Ice." James withdrew his hand, but not before his mouth twitched, just slightly, as if suppressing a smile. He looked at her, and for the first time, his gaze wasn't sharp or distant. It was softer, as if the tiny kick hadn't just surprised him, but had reached a part of him he didn't even know existed. "You're relentless," he muttered, his voice no longer flat, but carrying a trace of something lighter, something closer. Then, as if grounding himself, he stood up and returned to his desk. But his steps were slower, as if he wasn't quite ready to let the moment go. Ellie, still cradling her belly, watched him with a knowing smile. Quietly, she whispered to herself, "The ice is starting to crack, Ice King. Let's see what I can do next." But in James's mind, that small kick wasn't just a physical sensation. It was the first time he truly felt something. Something beyond contracts, beyond Ellie's playful antics. It was a connection, not just with Ellie, not just with their unusual marriage, but with the tiny life inside her. As he sat down at his desk, his fingers hovered over his laptop, but his mind wasn't on the numbers anymore. He took a slow breath, as if trying to suppress the unfamiliar warmth spreading inside him. And for just a fleeting moment, he wondered, was the ice he had built around himself really worth holding on to anymore? Chapter 4. Rising Tensions. Rain fell steadily outside James Caldwell's penthouse in Mayfair, droplets streaking down the large windows, blurring the distant lights of the Thames. Inside, the space had grown noticeably warmer since Ellie Hart had moved in. The faint scent of herb-roasted chicken from lunch still lingered in the kitchen, blending with the vibrancy Ellie had brought with her. A bright orange beanbag beside the gray leather sofa, 2 small potted plants on the windowsill, and a stack of old food magazines she had left on the coffee table. Yet James's cold presence remained. Sleek black wooden floors, bookshelves filled with financial documents, a constant reminder that he had not entirely let go of his icy exterior. Ellie, now 5 months pregnant, sat on the sofa, hugging a pillow, dressed in a loose sweater and comfortable jeans. She was watching a cooking show, something she often turned on for inspiration, while James sat at his desk, eyes fixed on his laptop, fingers typing steadily on the keyboard. He remained as rigid as ever, a white dress shirt buttoned to the top, black slacks, polished leather shoes neatly placed beside the desk. But lately he had been coming home earlier, no longer staying at the office late into the night. Ellie noticed, but she said nothing, simply smiling to herself every time he walked in carrying something in his hands. One rainy afternoon, James stepped into the apartment holding a striking bouquet of red roses, one of the rare things he bought that had nothing to do with food. He placed the flowers on the kitchen counter and said coolly, "I just picked them up on the way," before turning away as if it were nothing. Ellie was surprised. She got up from the sofa, walked over, and took a sniff. "Roses! That's unexpectedly romantic of you, Mr. Ice King," she teased, but immediately sneezed uncontrollably, her eyes turning red from allergies. She pushed the bouquet away, still sneezing as she joked, "Are you trying to kill me with flowers?" James hesitated, his hand lifting as if to do something, but he stopped midway. "I didn't know you were allergic," he said stiffly, turning his face away to hide his awkwardness. Ellie laughed, wiping her watery eyes. "It's okay. It's the thought that counts. But next time, get me something edible instead." James didn't respond, but a few days later he brought home a box of fresh strawberries, her favorite fruit, and placed it on the table, saying in his usual cold tone, "It was near the store, so I grabbed some." Ellie bit into a strawberry and winked. "Near the store or near your heart?" James didn't answer, merely sat down on the sofa and pretended to read the newspaper. But the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth did not escape Ellie's notice. She knew he cared about her, even if he was clumsy at showing it, always hiding behind his icy demeanor. But Ellie didn't want him to stay frozen forever. One rainy evening, as James arrived home, Ellie decided to break the ice in her own way. She switched off the cooking show on the TV and put on a British comedy, a silly one full of ridiculous jokes that she adored. Then she grabbed his hand and pulled him onto the sofa next to her. "Sit here and watch with me," Ellie said excitedly, tugging at his hand even as he resisted. "What are you doing?" he grumbled, trying to stand up, but Ellie grabbed his collar and forced him back down. "Watch a comedy, Mr. Ice King. If I can laugh, you can too." She pressed play, and laughter erupted from the TV as the main character tumbled down a staircase. Ellie burst into laughter, clutching her belly, tears streaming from her eyes. "Oh my God, did you see that? That's hilarious." James remained still, his face as expressionless as a statue, not a single muscle twitching. He watched her laugh, then turned back to the screen and muttered in a flat tone, "Ridiculous." Ellie stopped laughing and gave him a mischievous look. "Ridiculous, huh? Then I'll make you laugh." Without warning, she reached out and tickled his side, a bold move she knew would catch him off guard. James jerked, trying to evade her, but it was too late. A short, involuntary chuckle escaped his lips, an unfamiliar sound that stunned them both. Ellie let out a triumphant cheer, clapping her hands. "I win! You laughed, Mr. Ice King!" James's face reddened as he turned away, trying to regain his cold composure. "You're so annoying." But Ellie wasn't done. She jumped onto the sofa, pointing at him. "I knew it! You like laughing. Stop pretending." James smirked, this time more visible, but still refused to admit it. He stood up, intending to walk away, but Ellie grabbed his hand, her voice softening. "Stay and watch the rest with me. Minnie wants you to be happy too." James hesitated but sat back down. And this time, when another funny scene played, the main character being chased into a mud puddle, he didn't laugh out loud, but the corner of his eye twitched, and Ellie knew she had taken another step toward melting his ice. Another rainy evening, James came home late, completely drenched from forgetting his umbrella. By the next morning, he had a high fever, lying in bed with a pale face, sweat rolling down his forehead. Ellie only noticed when he didn't come out of his room as usual. She knocked on the door, but there was no response, so she stepped inside and found him lying there, his breathing heavy. "James, what's wrong?" she asked worriedly, placing a hand on his forehead. It was burning hot. James opened his eyes, his voice weak but still trying to sound cold. "I'm fine. Leave." Ellie frowned, ignoring him, and rushed to the kitchen to cook chicken porridge, the quickest thing she could make with chicken, ginger, and a bit of green onion. She brought the steaming bowl into his room, sat beside his bed, and scooped up a spoonful. "Eat. No arguing," she said, her voice unusually firm. James tried to sit up but was too weak, so he had no choice but to let her feed him. The warmth of the porridge slid down his throat, easing his shivers. As she fed him, Ellie spoke casually. "When I was little, my mom used to make porridge like this whenever I was sick. Now I'm taking care of you. Consider it payback for the sausage sandwich." James didn't respond, just looked at her, his fevered gaze softer than usual. When she finished feeding him, he suddenly reached out and held her hand, a clumsy, weak gesture, his fever-warm fingers lightly wrapping around hers. Ellie was taken aback, looking down to see his red-rimmed eyes. But she knew it wasn't just from the fever. It was the first time in years he had felt warmth from someone else. "James," she called softly. He didn't say anything, just squeezed her hand slightly before letting go and turning away, as if hiding his emotions. Ellie didn't tease him this time. She just sat there quietly, waiting for him to drift off to sleep. As she watched him, she whispered to herself, "You're warming up, Mr. Ice King." The next day, James recovered, but he never mentioned what had happened. He went back to his usual cold demeanor, but Ellie noticed small changes. He sat a little closer to her at dinner, and when she made pesto pasta, he not only ate it but also asked, "Is there more?" His tone awkward, as if reluctant to admit he liked it. Ellie laughed, realizing the ice around him had cracked deeper than she had expected. Outside the Mayfair penthouse, the rain continued to fall steadily, droplets streaking down the large windows, blurring the distant lights of the Thames. Inside, the space had grown much warmer than when Ellie Hart first moved in. The kitchen always carried the scent of her cooking, from herb-roasted chicken to pesto pasta, and the apartment now bore her touch. A bright orange beanbag, potted plants on the windowsill, and food magazines scattered across the coffee table. Ellie, now 7 months pregnant, her belly round and prominent, often sat on the sofa hugging a pillow, her eyes still mischievous but now tinged with exhaustion from the pregnancy. James Caldwell, though still maintaining his cold exterior with his crisp white shirts and black trousers, had changed. He came home earlier, bringing strawberries or grapes without needing a reason. And sometimes he would quietly sit near her while she cooked, even if he never admitted he enjoyed it. The breaking point. It was another rainy night when everything fell apart. Ellie was in the kitchen preparing a fresh batch of garlic toast, the one thing James couldn't resist, yet always called ridiculous. But as she reached for a plate, she heard his voice from the study. The door was slightly ajar. His deep, steady tone carried through the quiet apartment, and though she hadn't meant to eavesdrop, one sentence stopped her cold. Once she gives birth, she'll leave. I'll transfer an additional £500,000 as per the original agreement. His voice was calm, distant, like he was discussing an investment deal, not a person. Yes, the contract is clear. No emotions, no attachments. Ellie's grip tightened on the doorframe. Her breath caught in her chest. A sharp, icy wave of realization crashed over her, not from the cold rain outside, but from the weight of his words. £1.5 million to pay off the loan sharks. £500,000 for her to disappear. So that was it. The past months, the meals she had cooked with care, the jokes that had made him smile, the quiet moments when he brought home strawberries or stood near her in the kitchen, had meant nothing. She had thought she was breaking through his ice, but to James she was still just a contract to be completed. Tears welled in her eyes, but she bit her lip, refusing to cry. Silently she returned to the kitchen, turned off the oven, and sank onto the sofa, one hand resting on her belly as she watched the rain blur the city lights. A quiet change. From that night on, Ellie changed. She spoke less. The playful teasing, the mischievous laughter that used to fill the penthouse, all of it vanished. She still cooked chicken porridge, steak sandwiches, but she no longer asked James to taste them. She simply placed the plate on the table and withdrew to her beanbag, staring out the window in silence. She stopped putting smiley stickers on his laptop, stopped spilling sauce just so he'd have to clean it with her, stopped telling silly stories about her father. The apartment returned to its former quietness. But it wasn't the cold silence James had once lived in. It was a silence filled with something heavier, something missing. A realization too late. James noticed immediately. He had grown used to her laughter, her chaotic presence, the smell of her cooking that he could never resist. Now the absence of it all unsettled him. It was an unfamiliar, uncomfortable feeling, one he didn't know how to name. One evening, Ellie placed a plate of pesto pasta in front of him without a word. James didn't pick up his fork. Instead, he looked at her, curled up on the sofa, hand resting on her belly, staring distantly at the rain outside. His jaw tightened. "What's wrong with you?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. He set his newspaper aside, standing and walking toward her. "You've been quiet for days. I'm not used to it." Ellie turned, looking at him for a long moment. Then she smiled. But it wasn't her usual mischievous grin. It was small, tired, and heartbreakingly distant. "I thought you hated noise, James," she said softly, her voice carrying an emotion he couldn't quite place. "Our contract is almost up. I just wanted to leave a good impression, not as the annoying wife who always caused trouble." James stilled. His grip on the sofa edge tightened, as if her words had struck something deep in him. It was true. True to what he had once told his lawyer, to what he had believed when this all started. But hearing it now from her, it hurt, more than it should. He sat beside her, closer than usual, his deep blue eyes locking onto hers. "Was all of this just a contract to you?" he asked, his voice rough, unsteady in a way he didn't recognize. "Because I don't want it to be." Ellie's breath hitched. She stared at him, startled, as if she had misheard. "What?" she whispered. James exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He was terrible at this, at explaining, at emotions, but he couldn't let her misunderstand. I heard you, she continued, her voice breaking slightly. I heard you talking to your lawyer. After I give birth, I leave. Ainda la champondagal. A tear slid down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. I thought, I thought we had something more than that. James clenched his fists. For the first time in years, he felt helpless. I said that, he admitted, his voice raw, his gaze dropping to the floor. But I don't want that anymore. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to look at her again. I've gotten used to you. His voice was quiet but firm. To your laughter, your cooking, the way you drive me insane. I don't want you to go. Ellie sucked in a shaky breath. She had spent days convincing herself that he didn't care, that she had been foolish to believe otherwise. But now looking into his eyes, deep, dark, and filled with something she never thought she'd see in James Caldwell, she realized the truth. She wasn't the only one who had changed. No more contracts. Ellie stared at him, tears still falling, her breath unsteady. She wanted to believe him, but the words she had overheard still felt like a knife to her heart. Are you telling the truth, James? She asked, her voice breaking. Or are you only saying this because of Minnie, because of the contract? She held her belly as if shielding herself from another heartbreak. James lifted his gaze, and for the first time, Ellie saw his eyes, red-rimmed, on the verge of tears. But he didn't answer with words. Instead, he reached out and pulled her into his arms. It was clumsy, desperate, but strong, like he was afraid that if he let go, she would disappear. Ellie froze, her body stiff against him. But then she felt it, the warmth of him, the way his arms tightened around her, how his breath trembled against her hair. And then, in a voice rough with emotion, he whispered, not because of Minnie, not because of the contract, because of you. I want you to be real, Ellie. Ellie's tears fell harder, but this time they weren't from sadness. She buried her face against his chest, listening to the rapid, uneven rhythm of his heartbeat. For the first time, he wasn't Ice King James Caldwell anymore. She let out a shaky laugh through her tears. You're terrible at saying I love you, James. Her voice wavered. But I don't want to leave either. I thought you only saw me as part of a transaction. James held her tighter, his breath warm against her hair. No, he murmured, his voice low but firm. You're real. Minnie is real. I want us to be real. He didn't let go, as if his embrace could say what words never could. Ellie slowly pulled back, looking up at him. Her smile returned, not mischievous this time, but soft, genuine. I like you better this way, she whispered, her voice still shaky but full of hope. James exhaled, his lips twitching upward. This time, not a smirk, not something restrained, but a real smile. We need to cancel that contract, he said simply. Ellie blinked. Then she laughed, a real laugh, full of warmth, as if the last layer of ice between them had finally shattered. Outside, the rain kept falling, but inside their home, the last traces of cold were gone. Chapter 5. The Journey of Birth and the First Moments. The day Ellie Hart went into labor arrived on a drizzly September morning, with the London sky draped in a thick layer of gray. She was 9 months pregnant, her belly heavy, and the contractions had started at midnight. At first, they were just mild twinges, and she had even joked with James, Minnie's practicing boxing in here. But by dawn, the pain had grown unbearable. Clutching James's hand, she looked up at him. His face, usually composed like a venture capitalist navigating a financial crisis, was now pale despite his attempt to remain cold and calm. Take me to the hospital, Ice King, she gasped, her voice trembling with both pain and urgency. Minnie wants out. James, normally unfazed by million-pound negotiations, was suddenly a mess. He dropped the car keys twice. His hands shook as he helped Ellie into the car. And on the drive to the hospital, his grip on the steering wheel was tight, his voice slightly panicked. Are you okay? Don't scream. I'm driving here. Ellie, despite gritting her teeth through the contractions, let out a weak laugh. Are you more worried about me or the car? He didn't answer, just pressed his lips into a thin line, sweat beading on his forehead. 8 hours of chaos. At the hospital, Ellie's labor lasted nearly 8 hours. She lay on the hospital bed, gripping James's hand so tightly that his fingers turned purple. Through the pain, she screamed, "If you sign any more contracts, I swear I'll never forgive you." James never let go. His usually steady hands wiped the sweat from her forehead, his deep voice shaking as he whispered, "You can do this, Ellie." I, I'm here. The doctor called her strong. Ellie only managed a breathless laugh. "I make amazing roast chicken. What's childbirth compared to that?" And then with one final scream, a baby's cry filled the room, piercing through the tension. Meeting Lottie, James froze. His eyes widened as the nurse gently placed their daughter into Ellie's arms. A tiny, wrinkled, red-faced baby with soft brown hair. Ellie, exhausted but beaming, cradled her against her chest. "Hello, Minnie. You nearly killed me." She looked up at James. "Come here, Daddy Ice." James stepped forward, hesitant. His hands, usually so sure when signing multi-million-pound deals, trembled as the nurse carefully transferred the baby into his arms. For the first time in his life, he held his daughter. Awkward, stiff, like he was holding the most fragile treasure in the world. Lottie's tiny eyes fluttered open, meeting his. James stopped breathing for a second. His throat tightened, his vision blurred. Not from cold indifference, but from something warm, overwhelming, real. "Lottie," he murmured, his voice rough. "She looks like you." Ellie, still weak, chuckled. "If she's like me, she'll know how to break the ice." James bent down, pressing a gentle kiss to Lottie's forehead. Then lifting his gaze, he met Ellie's eyes. There was no coldness in him now, only something deep and unspoken, something that made Ellie's heart clench. He inhaled shakily before whispering, "Thank you, Ellie. For Lottie. For everything." Ellie blinked, startled. Then tears spilled down her cheeks. But this time, they weren't from pain. "You actually know how to say thank you, huh?" she teased, her voice wobbly with emotion. James didn't answer. He just held Lottie closer, letting her tiny cries fill the space between them, along with the warmth that had finally melted all the ice away. James Caldwell's penthouse in Mayfair was no longer a cold, minimalist space. The early spring sun streamed through the massive glass windows, illuminating a home filled with warmth, laughter, and charming chaos. Ellie's bright orange beanbag, once just her personal lounging spot, was now covered in plush baby toys. The two tiny potted plants on the windowsill had grown, thriving under her care, and the air was always rich with the scent of food, apple pie, roast chicken, pesto pasta, because despite the exhaustion of motherhood, Ellie never stopped cooking. Lottie, now 3 months old, had changed everything. Life was messier, busier, more chaotic, but also infinitely happier. And James Caldwell, once the Ice King, once the man who spoke in transactions and contracts, had become a father. A clumsy, awkward, completely smitten father, willing to do anything for his daughter, even if it meant getting baby spit on his expensive shirts. And for the first time, his world didn't feel like a carefully structured deal. It felt real. That morning, as the first rays of sunlight slipped through the curtains, Ellie was already awake. She stood in the kitchen, dressed in a loose sweater and jeans, stirring a pot of oatmeal for breakfast. It had been 3 months since she gave birth to Lottie, and though exhaustion clung to her from countless sleepless nights, her eyes sparkled every time she heard her daughter's tiny cries or the sweet sound of her giggles. James emerged from the bedroom, his hair uncharacteristically tousled. A rare sight, courtesy of staying up late soothing Lottie. In one hand, he held an empty baby bottle, his expression somewhere between exhaustion and reluctant affection. His white dress shirt was still there, but the top buttons were undone, sleeves rolled up, and instead of his usual tailored trousers, he wore a pair of casual joggers. Another sign of how much had changed. "She cried all night," he muttered, his voice low, no longer cold but tinged with weariness and something softer. Ellie turned around laughing. "Oh, wow, and you survived. I was expecting you to draft a contract to hire a full-time nanny by now, Mr. Ice King." James smirked, a sight that had become far more familiar in recent months, then placed the bottle on the counter. "I was trying to make her formula," he admitted, reaching for the container of powdered milk in the cabinet. But his hands shook slightly as he poured, spilling powder all over the counter. Ellie gasped dramatically, snatching the container from him. James, are you making baby formula or conducting a chemistry experiment? Lottie needs milk, not a science project. James stepped aside, watching as Ellie swiftly mixed the formula with practiced ease. She handed him the bottle with a teasing grin. Here, try again, and don't drop it this time. James took the bottle and made his way to the bassinet near the sofa, where Lottie lay wiggling her tiny arms. Her round eyes blinked up at him as he awkwardly lifted her head and positioned the bottle. Lottie latched onto the nipple immediately, sucking contentedly. James stiffened at first, his grip clumsy, but as he watched his daughter drink peacefully, something changed. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. Not a smirk. Not the usual half-hearted lift of his lips. A real, soft smile. Ellie, standing nearby with her arms crossed, watched him with amusement. Look at you, she teased, pressing a hand to her chest dramatically. The ice has completely melted, but you're still so awkward. James didn't argue. He just kept holding Lottie, watching her with a quiet, almost awed expression. Their new normal. Life now revolved around Lottie, an exhausting, messy, but undeniably sweet whirlwind. Ellie continued her freelance journalism work, typing away on her laptop whenever Lottie napped. And James, despite still managing a multi-million-pound investment firm, had significantly cut back on late nights at the office. Instead of staying until midnight, he came home early. And every time without fail, he brought home something. Strawberries, grapes, oranges, the little things Ellie loved. Just happened to pass by, he would say casually, dropping the bag on the counter. But Ellie knew better. It was never just convenient. It was his way of caring, even if he would never outright say it. One morning, as Ellie stood in the kitchen baking an apple pie, Lottie lay in her stroller nearby, babbling happily, until suddenly she let out a loud wail. James, who had been reading the newspaper on the sofa, immediately shot up, alarm flashing across his usually composed face. "What's wrong with her?" he asked, his voice edged with rare panic. Ellie peeked out from the kitchen, barely holding back laughter. "She probably needs a diaper change, Mr. Ice King." She gave him a teasing wink. "Go ahead, I'm busy baking." James frowned, turning to Lottie with the same intense focus he reserved for high-stakes business deals. Then hesitantly, he reached for a fresh diaper from the nearby bag. Ellie bit her lip, suppressing a grin. This was going to be fun to watch, where the ice finally melts. James placed Lottie on the changing table, his hands unsteady as he unfastened her diaper. In the process, he managed to knock an entire pack of baby wipes onto the floor. "Help me," he grumbled, clearly out of his depth. But Ellie just stood beside him, arms crossed, grinning. "Nope, you need to learn. I'm not changing Lottie's diapers forever, you know." James sighed, then awkwardly wiped Lottie clean. He fumbled with the new diaper, putting it on backward, twice, before finally getting it right. Lottie squirmed a little, and then, out of nowhere, she smiled. A small, innocent, utterly heart-melting smile. James froze. He looked at her tiny, beaming face, then turned to Ellie, stunned before his lips curved into something rare and beautiful. A smile that was neither hesitant nor restrained, but full of warmth. "She smiled at me," he said, his deep voice laced with awe. Ellie stepped forward, scooping Lottie into her arms and pressing a kiss to her chubby cheek. "Because you're the cutest dad ever." She glanced at James, seeing his eyes softer than she had ever known them to be, and warmth bloomed in her chest. Lottie giggled happily, then reached her tiny hands toward James, as if asking to be held. This time he took her into his arms without hesitation, and this time he didn't shake. A new kind of lesson. The next day, Ellie decided to celebrate early by baking a tiny apple cake for Lottie's upcoming milestone. She dragged James into the kitchen, handing him a piping bag filled with vanilla frosting. "Come on, Ice King. Time to learn how to bake." James attempted to decorate the cake, only to smear frosting everywhere. Ellie burst into laughter. "Are you making a cake or abstract art?" James, who usually would have rolled his eyes, laughed out loud for the first time, completely unguarded. "Maybe you're just a terrible teacher." Lottie, waking from her nap, giggled as she saw her parents laughing together. And in that little kitchen with frosting-covered hands and a messy counter, they found happiness in its simplest, sweetest form. A question under the London lights. One spring evening, James took Ellie and Lottie to Tower Bridge. The night air was crisp, the lights of London reflecting on the Thames. James walked beside Ellie, pushing Lottie's stroller with one hand, the other laced with hers. Then he stopped. Reaching into his pocket, his hands trembling slightly, he pulled out a small box. Inside was a simple, elegant ring. "You make me warm," he said, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain, his eyes looking down. "Stay with me?" His voice dropped lower. "For real this time?" Ellie blinked, stunned. Then she laughed, a bright, joyful, tear-filled laugh. "That was the worst proposal ever," she teased, her eyes shimmering. "But okay, only if you learn to cook with me." James exhaled, relief flashing in his gaze as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Then he pulled her into his arms. "Deal. No regrets." As Ellie leaned into him, she whispered, "Do you regret anything?" "Me? Lottie?" James tilted her chin up, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Never," he said. "A wedding by the Thames." A few weeks later, they married in a quiet ceremony by the river. No extravagance, just family, close friends, and the sound of the Thames flowing gently beside them. Ellie wore a simple white dress, James a familiar gray suit, and Lottie, snuggled in her stroller, giggled as her parents exchanged vows. James looked at Ellie, his expression full of something he once believed he wasn't capable of. "Thank you," he murmured, "for everything." Ellie grinned. "Oh, Ice King, you're officially Chef Dad now." James laughed, a full, open laugh, wrapping his arms around both her and Lottie. And as their laughter carried over the river, the last traces of ice finally melted away. Thank you for following this heartfelt story of Soul Stories channel. Share your thoughts about the story in the comments below. If you believe that true love can withstand all trials and sometimes begins in the simplest of ways, don't forget to hit the like button and share this story with your friends. To never miss out on touching and meaningful stories, subscribe to our channel and help us spread messages of love and warmth to everyone. Let's cherish the beautiful moments of life and love together.